All right, once again, good evening, everyone. I think recognizing that it's 6:05, we can go ahead and get started with tonight's session. So, again, welcome to tonight's public engagement session for the Central Kingston Growth Strategy. We'll be hosting an online Q&A tonight. My name is Mark Nardi. I'm a communications officer with the City of Kingston, and I will be your facilitator for this evening. Tonight's session will be conducted by the project team from the City's Department of Planning Services. A few notes before we get started. The session is live streamed and recorded. As you join the session, you should have seen two notices appear on your Zoom platform, one indicating that it is being recorded and the other indicating that the session is being live streamed. The session will be live streamed on our YouTube page, and immediately after the session concludes, it will then be converted over to a recording, at which point you'll be able to watch it once again. Just for your awareness, video, microphone, and chat features have all been turned off for your own privacy. In the event that you choose to ask a question via raising your hand, which we will cover in a second, you will be unmuted, so just for your consideration. So we recognize that technology problems do happen from time to time. We do have a couple solutions for you here. So first and foremost, if you are having any issues, please try and adjust your view options in your Zoom window. You can also ask any Zoom questions in the chat, and I will be monitoring and happy to address what I can. The alternative to that is you can raise your hand. Again, you see the bottom there, it's just in your Zoom toolbar. If that's not working for you, you can call into the meeting. The number is bolded on the screen here, and please make sure you're using the correct webinar ID. So you would be using the one for the 6 p.m. webinar. So I recommend that you do jot that down. And the other alternative is you can watch the live stream on YouTube as well. As this is a Q&A, we will have two ways for residents to ask questions. The first is by using the Q&A tool. So you can see again an image of the navigation bar. Scroll down to the bottom and you will see a Q&A button pop up. You can then click that button and type in your questions. Staff will be able to acknowledge your questions as they come in and will be responding verbally. The other alternative is you can raise your hand. Again, it's just at the bottom of your taskbar there. If you raise your hand or click the raise hand button, I will see a notification by your name. I will then go ahead and unmute you and prompt you to speak. You can ask your question, at which point you will again be muted and staff will answer your question. Just to ensure everyone's had a chance to ask their questions, we're going to go with one question. And then if you have a follow-up question, we'll ask that you just raise your hand again and we will address you in turn just to make sure that everyone does have a chance to get a question out there. On the screen are the guidelines for participation. These govern all of our public engagement sessions. At this point, I'd like to ask if anyone in attendance has anything they'd like to add to the public engagement session. If you do, please raise your hand and we can note that. Like I said, but seeing no hands at this point in time, we will agree that these are the guidelines for participation and we can go ahead and move along with the rest of the session. I ask that you keep these in mind as the session proceeds. Before I pass things over to planning staff, we do have the agenda here. So the session is scheduled to begin at 6 p.m. Things are a little later. We're about 5 minutes behind schedule. So after my introductions, I will pass things over to the project team. And after that, they will deliver a short presentation, which should run until about 6:30, at which point we'll turn things over to a Q&A with the staff. And we are scheduled to run until 7 p.m. In the event that staff aren't able to address all of your questions, we will give you some alternatives where you can email staff and set up a conversation with them to address additional questions that you may have. With that in mind, I'm going to pass things over to Sukriti Agarwal with the city's planning department to run through the presentation.
Thanks, Mark. Good evening and welcome everyone to this Q&A session about the Central Kingston Growth Strategy. My name is Sukriti Agarwal and I'm the Manager of Policy Planning with Planning Services. I'm joined here today by Mike Salagi, Senior Planner, and Niall Odie, Senior Planner from Planning Services. So just a very quick overview of what has been done so far on this project. The recommendations for official plan and the new zoning bylaw prepared by the project consultants, WSP Canada Group Limited, were presented at a public meeting before the Planning Committee on August 12th. Staff are continuing to receive feedback on these recommendations and may propose further refinements to the proposed official plan policies and the proposed zoning regulations to be incorporated in the new zoning bylaw. At this time, the zoning recommendations have already been integrated into the second draft of the new zoning bylaw, which is available on the city's website. However, as I mentioned, we are continuing to seek feedback on these recommendations. So with that, I am happy to introduce Mike Silagi, Senior Planner, who will be taking us through the project background and a high-level summary of the recommendations.
Thank you, Sukriti. As Sukriti mentioned, my name is Mike Silagi. This presentation will be pretty brief. We trust and hope that you've had an opportunity to have a look at the full presentation to Planning Committee, or had a chance to review the documents which were posted on the city's website in support of that presentation. So this is really meant as a bit of a refresher. So I'll quickly go through some of the key points that came up in that presentation. Next slide, please. So just to start off, looking first at the actual geographic study area, which is identified in yellow on this map, that is comprising the 16 neighborhoods that make up the central Kingston area. Some of the areas left out, which you'll see in other colors, are areas that are subject to their own policy framework that are in existence or will be underway soon. That includes North Kingstown, Kingston Provincial Campus Secondary Plan, Downtown Harbour area, as well as the Williamsville Main Street. Next slide, please. So the overall goals and objectives for the CKGS study were first within that yellow area to identify strategic areas where the greatest amount of intensification could occur with policy and zoning framework developed in support of those areas. We're looking at accommodating upwards of 4,000 units within the central Kingston area. So it's important to identify those strategic areas that can accommodate the greatest growth. And for the areas outside the intensification area, not to really cap development in those areas, but to try to develop policy and zoning guidance to more appropriately manage the development within those areas that are a bit more context specific. And with those, to prepare design guidelines for both the intensification and non-intensification areas, as well as do an assessment of the available infrastructure and services within the study area. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, one of the objectives was to identify these strategic intensification areas, which you can see identified in the reddish orange color on this map. Those areas were identified based on several criteria, which include access to major corridors at the edges of neighborhoods, areas that had existing multi-unit or higher density development, access to transit and active transportation infrastructure, access to various amenities, services, and institutions such as retail, service, commercial, schools, etc. Also based on infrastructure considerations. And finally, throughout the lifetime of the project, various community feedback and public input that we received. So I'll just very quickly go through them. Next slide, please. First, looking on the east end here, the east end of the study area, the Brock and Johnson corridors, which, next slide, please, were meant to accommodate upwards of 6 stories or 20 meters apartment buildings, set back 2 meters from Johnson Street and 3 meters from, Johnson and Brock, and 3 meters from the side streets to match the development from the lower intensity residential development. There's also a 10-meter setback at the rear yard with a 2-meter landscape buffer. That is something that you'll see in a number of the intensification areas. As I said, these will be 6 stories with a minimum 4-story street wall and a step back of 2 meters at the 5th and 6th story. The intent is for this to be largely residential. However, we did want to provide an opportunity, not necessarily require it, but provide the opportunity that if retail is desired, to allow that on the ground floor as well. Next slide, please. Now moving to the southwest corner. Next slide. You can see moving west along Johnson. This is at the intersection of Johnson and Portsmouth, as well as Portsmouth across from St. Lawrence College. Next slide, please. You'll see this in both areas of this intensification area, but up to 4 stories or 12 meters, whichever is lesser, walk-up apartment buildings or stacked townhomes, again, employing the 10-meter setback at the rear with the 2-meter buffer. Next slide, please. And similarly, at the more southern end of Portsmouth Avenue here at Churchill Street, again, the 4 stories or 12-meter apartment buildings. Next slide, please. Moving north along Portsmouth, there was a slightly different approach in the Calderwood Drive area because maybe you'll note on the left hand of your screen, there's a bit of a unique lotting in this area where we have double frontage along Portsmouth and Woodstone. So same intensity with a 4-story building. However, what we envision for this area is more back-to-back townhomes or townhomes on both sides with central parking areas. Just some approach to that ensures that both Woodstone and Portsmouth are addressed by any future development. Next slide, please. Now moving north toward Bath Road and Sir John A. This area was slated to accommodate the greatest form of intensification, largely owing to the fact that it was already zoned for high density development and had a number of taller buildings in the area. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So along both Sir John A. and Bath Road, the recommendations envision 12-story buildings with a 6-story podium. And then taking some of our cues from the work done on the Williamsville Main Street study, above the 6-story, there will be step backs for the towers, and they will be limited in plate size to about 790 square meters and also include tower separation. Whereas when addressing Wright Crescent, in order to help with the transition from that more intense form of development, you can go to the next slide, please. Similar to what was seen on Johnson and Brock, a 6-story apartment building, again with a 4-story street wall and the step back above the 4th story. In this case, residential, again, to try to better transition toward the lower intensity development on Wright Crescent. Next slide, please. In terms of the non-intensification areas, a number of recommendations were put forward, largely taken into the zoning that Sukriti had mentioned before. And that includes removing the floor space index and lot coverage provisions because there's quite a variety of lot forms within the central Kingston area. It was determined that these provisions really were often inappropriate or sometimes even counterproductive. So instead, we are relying largely on setbacks and this new maximum building depth set at 18 meters from the minimum front yard setback, and where the minimum front yard setback in many areas is now established at 4.5 meters with the flexibility to vary depending on the existing context. In addition, both meters and stories are going to be included to measure height so that we are more clear on the intention for height in various areas, and an inclusion of minimum lot frontages. Next slide, please. Within the existing medium to high density areas, for the 3 to 6 family dwelling or B zone, we're also looking to include a minimum lot frontage, add that maximum building depth, which again will be 18 meters measured from the minimum front yard setback. And that front yard setback is also recommended to be 4.5 meters with that flexibility to vary depending on the context. For the multiple family dwellings in the B1 zone, instead of using density requirements, the recommendation is to use minimum lot area requirements and removing minimum unit sizes in multifamily zones, which are more appropriately covered within the building code. Next slide, please. So moving forward, we will continue to receive comments and feedback on the recommendations from the CKGS documents until November 5th. Those comments will be assessed and brought into future planning processes. As mentioned, or as Sukriti mentioned, those zoning recommendations have already been integrated into the new draft of the zoning bylaw, which was released in early August. So you can either send comments to us, or if you aren't already involved in that process, you can get involved with the new zoning bylaw process and provide your comments there. With the official plan policy recommendations, we will be looking to initiate an official plan amendment shortly this fall to add a new section 10G to provide the policy guidance for allowing those proposed intensification areas. As I said, that will be undertaken shortly, and we envision a public meeting in early to mid-December of this year. And so if you'd like to see the full presentation made to Planning Committee on August 12th, that is available on the city's YouTube page. If you have any difficulty finding that, or if you have any future questions or comments after this evening's event, feel free to reach out directly to myself at msalagi@cityofkingston.ca or to Security at sargawal@cityofkingston.ca. Thank you for your time, and I will turn it back to Mark for the beginning of the Q&A process.
Thanks very much. So we're now moving on to the Q&A portion of the session. As I mentioned, there are two ways that you can go about asking questions: using the Q&A button at the bottom. You can type your questions in there, or you can hit the raised hand button and we'll go ahead and unmute you. Just for your consideration, please make sure that you're using the Q&A tool and the chat. They're very similar looking icons, and the difference, of course, is that the Q&A will be monitoring for questions, whereas if it's in the chat, it may go missed, and we want to make sure we're catching everyone's questions. So just a note on that. Having said that, I believe we see our first question in the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over. So David Gordon says the notice of the second draft of the zoning bylaw is dated for August 6th. Do you know if that's a version?
Yep. So thanks, Dave, for that comment. Yes, so the second draft of the new zoning bylaw is dated August 6th. So, and that's the date that that draft was released, and it incorporated the recommendations coming out of the Central Kingston Growth Strategy.
Okay, great. So we don't have any additional questions at this point in time. So what we might actually do is leave things open for another. Okay, great. Actually, good question.
Mark, I see one more question from Dave. So Dave, August 6th was also the date when we released the recommendations of the Central Kingston Growth Strategy. So the new zoning bylaw and the Central Kingston Growth Strategy final recommendations report, they were both released on August 6th. It's just that the meeting happened on August 12th, but both of the documents were posted on the city's website on August 6th.
So the changes that were requested in the public meeting of the planning committee in August, later in August, I think it was the 12th or the 15th, none of them have been incorporated in the zoning bylaw or in the report that's going to council?
So none of those changes have yet been incorporated. The intent is that when the final draft of the new zoning bylaw is released, which at this time we are looking at early 2022, at that time the changes will be incorporated. So staff are still seeking comments and feedback on those recommendations that were made available in August. So yeah, so none of that has been incorporated yet, but like I said, we are just continuing to seek feedback, and we will be making further refinements to those recommendations.
Okay, again, so if we go through an extended period where we don't have any questions, what we can do is we can leave things open for another minute or so. So just give everyone a chance to kind of go through things, jot any additional questions that they may have down, collect your thoughts. But if we don't have any additional questions, I think what we might do is just move ahead towards the conclusion of the session. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and mute myself for a second, give everyone about a minute or so, and we can follow up after. And while I'm waiting, I do want to just put a quick PSA out there. If anyone's having any tech issues, if they're trying to ask a question from the other side of the webinar, try using the chat feature. And I've got it open right here. I'll be keeping an eye on it, or Q&A or raise hand, of course. But you try using the chat if you are having any problems, or else we will assume that we don't have any questions at this point in time. All right, so we do have another question from David. And David is asking, what opportunity will we have for follow-up on the changes we requested in August? The deadline for comments is next week.
Dave, thank you for that question. I know that we have indicated the deadline of November 5th for any feedback on the recommendations. However, staff will continue to take recommendations or comments. It's not that we will not accept any comments after that. It's just that if the sooner we can get feedback on those recommendations, it will be easier for us to incorporate that in the final draft of the new zoning bylaw. As Mike mentioned, we will be undertaking an official plan amendment to provide policy guidance for the intensification area. So of course, right, those comments will continue to come in until staff are in a position to prepare a comprehensive report and make a recommendation to the planning committee. But yeah, that November 5th deadline, it's not like a hard deadline. It was just meant to be so that we can get as much time as possible after that deadline to be able to work on that bylaw.
Okay, so seeing no additional questions at this point in time, I think we can move things along. We're now finishing ahead of schedule. So I guess the first thing I'd like to say is thanks to everyone for taking the time on their evening to join us for this public engagement. It was great to have you along to hear more about the Central Kingston Growth Strategy and share your questions. So we are going to launch a quick public engagement poll here. You'll see it appear on your screen now. If you have a moment, please go ahead and just answer the questions here. This doesn't have to do with the Central Kingston Growth Strategy. It'll be used by the communications department to assess our public engagement process. Otherwise, once again, we'd like to thank you for attending. If you have any follow-up questions relating to the Central Kingston Growth Strategy, you can go ahead and reach out to planning staff at the emails provided in the presentation. And with that in mind, we'll leave the presentation open while we allow individuals to complete the poll, but otherwise you can go ahead and log off. Thanks again for joining us.